Good day, everybody. Here we are talking about decisions. The decision is made. Maybe the most important aspect of education is to train, teach, educate individuals on how to make the best decisions. How they can do the proper research and analysis. Research is gathering the information to make a good decision. Analysis is breaking apart what you've researched to find out the histories, the backgrounds, also some perspectives, some foregrounds, and then making the best decision based on the educations that the person has, also their experiences. We need both education and experiences in order to make good decisions. Education provides that foundation, the knowledge of what has been, what could be. Experience showcases that here is the knowledge, but when you implement it in a certain environment, things change, it modifies. There's that very famous quote in boxing that the match changes with the first punch, which means that you have an idea of who your opponent is and how to create a strategy to beat your opponent. But as soon as you get in the ring, you also don't know what your opponent's strategy is. And you may need to modify your strategy once you find out the strategy of your opponent. The fight changes with the first punch. Great statement. So we need education, we need experience. We need to understand the complexities of a situation, the complexities of the human mind. There's so many aspects associated with decision making that it can beguile even the most studied of individuals. That's the topic of today. How can we make the best decision possible under an array of circumstances? Hopefully, at the end, we'll be able to say we've learned how best to make a decision under these circumstances and complexities. Start with a quote. Some years ago, I went to a speech by Ann Richards. She was the first elected governor, female governor of Texas. So a remarkable achievement. And she said during this presentation, she said, "Fools rush in where fools have been before." Never forgot that statement. Must have been 10, 15 years ago I saw the speech by Governor Ann Richards. Fools rush in where fools have been before. Not sure if it's her statement or if she got it from somewhere else, but the thought is that if you rush through a decision-making process, if you make a decision without understanding all of the variables and factors associated with the decision, you may make a foolish decision. That's where fools rush in, where fools have been before. Our goal, of course, is not to be a fool. We want to make sure we don't rush. We take the time to go through, as we learned, some type of process, some type of procedure. The good thing about processes and procedures is it forces us to go through each specific step. Without a process, then we may miss a step. So it is regimented. That's one of the aspects that we learn. It's a more regimented approach, but it's really to train our mind to go through certain steps, but also not to forget one aspect or another. That's the agenda of today. To learn about decision making, how to avoid making the wrong decisions, some considerations that we really want to take into account, a process or two that you may want to follow, and then what we would offer as effective decision making. In other words, if you were to remember one or two or three things about making a good decision, the best decision, these are some to remember. Let's start with the background. What are decisions? Decisions are choices among alternatives. One thing we want to remember the most is that the more choices you have, the better decisions that you make. If there's only one way to get to a place you want to go, if there's only one road, that's the only choice you have. Whether it's 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, or an hour, you have to take that choice. But if you have 2 or 3 or 4 choices, then maybe it won't take you an hour to get there. You could take the one that has 20 minutes away. That's the best aspect of having more choices, more alternatives. If you have more alternatives, you have more choices. In general, a decision, a problem, is a discrepancy between current and desired state of affairs. That's a problem. Our reaction to that problem is to make a decision. So, if we want to make more money, that is the problem that we have. The choice is how can we do that? Wrong decisions are often made for a number of reasons, and we want to avoid making wrong decisions. As we look at effective decision making at the end, it's almost the opposite of what we see here, but it helps frame our mind on some of the complexities associated with making decisions. Yes, a lack of information. If you have to make a quick decision, it may not be the right decision. You don't get to think it through. Part of what we're spending time today is think through the decision to make the right decision. You have to be afforded the right time. You also have to have resources as well. That comes from lack of information. So we see at the bottom of this list the time constraints. The top of the list is lack of information. There's a great saying that talks about knowns and unknowns. And sometimes there's unknowns and unknowns. Kind of makes an interesting discussion. What it means is there's some aspects of a decision we know about and some decisions that we don't know about. For instance, we have this information. We wish we had that information. It's not available. If you're trying to buy a home and you want to know what the interest rate is in 2 months, that's an unknown. But there's also some aspects that are unknown unknowns, which means we never would have thought of that. If you buy a piece of property and you have all of the data related to that property, but then you may find out once you start digging that it happened to be a burial ground, or it happened to have some contaminants in it that no one knows about. No one would have known about. Unknowns. Lack of information. Ego and self-interest are some issues that we see, and that is where your mind is not able to make the right decision because of your heart in some ways. You don't think through a prescribed decision-making process because instead you have some ego, self-interest, or you have some hope that is interfering with your ability to really make the right decision. So time is one, lack of information is another. But then you also have to control what I call your person. You have to make the decision based on the facts that are presented to you and that you can research in the process without saying, I hope, I wish, I want. We'll talk more about those three. But decisions made by I hope, I wish, I want often are not going to be the best decision. They may be the decision you like at that time, but it may not be the decision over the longer term. Why? Because good judgment comes from experience. Experience comes from bad judgment. What does that mean? Good judgment comes from experience. Experience comes from bad judgment. This is a presentation that we hope is interesting. However, someone may walk away from this presentation and not remember some of the key points that we want to make. They often don't remember the key points that we want to make until they made a decision they wish they wouldn't have made. Then they realize, aha, maybe I should have listened to my mom, my dad, my cousin, my friend. But you often don't know that until you get into the situation and you make a bad judgment and say, I'm never going to do that again. When we think of older people, we think they're quite wise. Are they? Much of their wisdom just comes from experience. Much of their decision comes from making the bad decisions throughout their life. And as they get older, as there's less time ahead and more time behind, they start to realize, I shouldn't have made that decision. I shouldn't have been so rash or capricious. So good judgment does come from experience. And that experience often, sadly, unfortunately, comes from bad judgment. As we look at making decisions, there are some considerations that we should make sure that we recognize. Decisions are complicated based on the size and length of commitment. If the issue is, I'm trying to make a decision on something that's going to happen today or tomorrow, at that point the decision's over, there's less that you can do. So if you don't have to commit much in terms of size, length, money, then the decision isn't as consequential. If you have to commit more of your time, more of your money, then the decision becomes, of course, much more complicated. Quantifiability of variables. If you can statistically, factually have some research that helps you determine the decision. For instance, 99% of the people who make this decision in this way are successful. Quite easy. Easy to make that decision. The better quantifiable aspects you have, the easier it is to make a decision. 75% that bought in this neighborhood saw a 20% increase in their value of what they bought within 3.5 months. Oh, that's a great statistic. We do that with stocks and bonds. If your plans can be easily changed and modified, then the decision is easier to make. That's what we look for. Okay, I'm gonna go in this direction, but if I find out it's not the right direction, it's going to be quite easy for me to make a modification. The certainty of outcome. If the outcome is more certain, of course, it's an easier decision. And then the human impact is something that we look at. If it impacts a friend, someone that you care quite considerably about, decision makes it more difficult for you. Same with like robots. If you're making a decision on where to deploy a robot in an organization, it's quite easy. They don't have any human feelings. But if that same decision affects a human being, it's more of an emotional decision. And emotional decisions are those that can be quite complicated, especially when you're attached to that specific human being is greater. If it's a friend, a good friend, or even a family member. So given what we've learned so far, what are some of the decision-making processes that we should follow? I'm going to go over 3. And why do I go over 3? Because I always recommend that individuals or organizations create a process that works for them. I have one that works for me, which I'll get to in a bit. But we hope that you have a process that in some ways you can codify in your mind, says this is the way I'm going to make a decision. We now know, a couple slides ago, that no matter what the decision-making process is, we have to follow it. And when it becomes more emotional, it makes it harder for us to follow a process. Again, though, we follow a process because we don't want to miss a step, and that's so important. By going through the 3, 4, 5, 6 steps of a decision-making process, it forces your mind to think through each of those steps. However, if emotionally the decision is going to be made no matter what process that you go through, make the decision and you have to live with the consequences. I wrote something some years ago about choices and consequences. The consequences are dictated by the choices we make. Make better choices, the consequences may be better. So our hope is that you follow a process that leads you to a better decision, whether you like the decision or not. So, a general type of decision-making process is, what's the central problem? Define the problem. Second is, what are the causes? As we list the causes, that may be 3, 4, 5, 6, the more causes the better, then we're going to come up with the central cause. What is the cause that we can choose that is going to have the most impactful consequence of the organization? So it may be 6 reasons why morale in the organization is not good. However, if we tackle this aspect in the organization, the consequence is we're going to address so many of the issues. We don't have time to address 5, but we can do the most important. Alternatives. Now we know what the central, or what we call the root cause is. What are some of the alternatives that we have? So we list the alternatives, and then we pick the alternative that best addresses the specific problem or issue. One should go to the other. Once we have identified what the problem is, identified what some of the causes are, including the root cause, identify some of the alternatives to resolve, address, or solve that problem, then from there we choose the alternative that best meets that problem. And we create an action plan. Okay, we know what we want to do. How are we going to do it? So we moved from what to how and when. Then we create a contingency plan. Contingency plans are so important because if a problem doesn't work, in the heat of the moment, when the problem's not working, we may not have time to address and readdress some of the problems, some of the issues, some of the alternatives. So we have to have a contingency plan in place if and when what we thought was the best alternative doesn't work. Why does the best alternative doesn't work? Maybe, just maybe, because we didn't understand or could not have predicted the human element. We did not know that when we present the issue or the plan to address the lack of morale or motivation, that our employees would have reacted in that manner. In some ways, it's tough to predict human condition, human response, human behavior, as much as we study it. So we have to have a contingency plan. If this plan does not work by this day, if we don't see this result in our sales, profits, revenues, whatever it may be, then at this date we will follow this process. So those are decision-making general processes and steps that we would follow. I have two. One's called Alfior, the other's called Roga. I created these. They may not work for you. As I mentioned, create something that works for you. Roga is one that I use often. And I use an acronym because it's easy for me to remember. Roga is, you do your research first, and then you determine your odds. Okay, based on the research, which includes gathering facts, statistics, also opinions, interviews, perspectives. Okay, I have all that information. Now, what are my odds? If I go this way, I'm at 50%. I have 40% here, 60%. Sometimes I may only have a 10% chance of winning, of success. However, the third aspect is have guts to make the right decision. There's times when I may say 10% is well enough. It's good enough. I know that my opportunity of success is low with 10%, but the consequences can be quite significant. You find this with people who say, I don't like my current job. I'm going to move across the country because there's this chance that this job may work out. It may not. But then you go back to a couple slides when I talk about the consequence of decisions, but also some of the factors that you should consider in making a decision. And maybe if this doesn't work out, even though I only have a 10% chance of success, if it doesn't work out, well, I'm not going to lose that much. I'm not going to lose much time. I'm not going to lose much research. And then you make your adjustments. If it doesn't work out within 3 months or 6 months, I'm going to move back. I haven't lost much. But if you have to give up so much, then that 10% doesn't look as good. Alfior. That says where you go out and listen. Listen as much as you can. Remember, if the only person you listen to is yourself, then only the information that you have, research, facts, statistics, in your own mind is what you're going to use to make a decision. You'll have no other perspectives to listen to other than your own. That's why you need to listen. Consult widely. And then gather facts. Facts, statistics, theories are so important in making decisions. It is a factor. Some may say even the most important factor. So many don't gather facts and statistics because it takes time and effort. And we don't want to spend the time or effort to gather the facts and statistics. Oh, I know what I'm going to do. This happened 2 years ago and this is what I did. But the circumstances and situations, the scenarios may have changed. Third is exposure. And this is very similar to odds, which is what can happen. Okay, if I make this decision, what do we see as consequences? Associated with exposure, you often ask yourself, can I live with that? Which is something I often talk to others about when I do consulting or contracting. Okay, this is the expected outcome. Is that something you can live with? And if you can't, then that's not the decision that you can make. That also goes personal, of course. I need to talk to so-and-so. Well, if you talk to somebody, it may not end well. It may ruin a friendship. It may ruin a partnership, a business relationship. Is that something you can live with? Yeah, I can. No, I can't. Exposure. Options. Then you say, here are our options. And then you make the recommendation. I say recommendation as opposed to a decision because for some, if not many, if not most of us, we often don't get to make the decision, but we have some influence on the recommendation. We have some influence on the decision based on a recommendation. That's where facts, statistics, theories, cases come into play. The more that you can frame a decision, the more that you can create the backgrounds that present a decision to somebody else in a way that they're going to say, it's impossible not to make the decision that you're recommending. That's where you truly have the influences in your environment. So I follow Roga and Alfior, one or the other. I tend to follow Roga more because I like the word guts. That you got to have the guts to make a decision. You got to have the guts to make the right decision. The consequential decision for yourself. We should judge in isolation, not in totality. I love this one. I love this statement, which means that we don't look at one scenario. We don't look at one aspect. Instead, we look at all aspects. We judge in isolation, not in totality. And I like this slide because when we judge in totality, when we look at all situations, we have a sense of serenity and peace in our decision. At the end of the day, we could sit back and have a cup of coffee and say, I made the right decision. That serenity and peace, even confidence, comes from realizing that we looked at every aspect of a decision, not just one. It gives us a sense of comfort in the decision that we made. Because at the end you can walk away, have that cup of coffee and say, I did my best. I did my best. I made the decision based on a totality of circumstances. I'm comfortable with the decision that is made, no matter the outcome that we see. Great way. It's a great way to make a decision and to be comfortable with the decision that's made. And leads us to effective decision making. So, some considerations that I would take into account as we look at effective decision making. First of all, follow a process. We've went over that. Hopefully everybody understands that a process, again, forces your mind to go through certain steps so that nothing is left to chance. You may not at the end make the right decision, but you would have looked at every aspect. Second, hopefully in the process, but throughout the process, is facts first, opinions last. There's no reason to go through a decision-making process if you know what the decision is going to be, regardless of anything that arises in the decision-making process. It's always facts first and opinions last. It's not what we want, what we hope. It is what we need, which is the third steps. It's what you need, not what you want. Wish and hope are fine, but not in consequential decision-making instances that are going to impact you for quite some time. And collaborate. Collaborate is very similar to team building, team interactions, team relationships. It's talking with those who may have had experiences in the situation or who may have some influence on the decision. Collaborate's important. And the hope is, in the decision-making process, that you have the ability to take your time to make a decision. If you don't have the time, the decision is going to be compromised. It may not be the best decision, but in some ways you have no choices about that. If it was a decision that you've put off for some time, that's your and our fault. If it's a decision that comes up at the last minute or was not predicted that decision would have to come up, there's not much that you can do. You have to make the best decision based on the available resources that you have. For those who remember the Roga, the process I just talked about, you have to have guts to take risks. And sometimes, going through a decision-making process, you may only have a 5 or 10% chance of success. But at the end, you're saying, I'm willing to take that risk. I'm willing to accept the consequences of a decision that the facts may not state is going to be a good decision. The statistics may say is not a good decision. However, regardless of everything I've learned, I'm taking this decision because I think I just think that this is going to be the best decision. It may be contrary to what we just talked about facts first, opinions last. But what we have to realize with decision-making process is, if you go through the entire decision-making process, whatever you decide is your process. But at the end you say, everything may be against it, but I'm making this decision because I have a feeling that this may work out. It's still okay to make that decision. That still could be the right decision because you're comfortable with the decision at the end. You may realize the decision may not work, but you're comfortable with the consequences, and that's one of the most important parts about making decisions, is being comfortable with the consequences. To go through a pedestrian decision-making process and to make the decision that a process says is the best decision may work at that time, may work for a long time, may work over time. But in those few instances that the decision you make may be contrary to the process that you followed, but you have a feeling that that is the best decision at the time, and you're ready to live with, accept the consequences, that may be the best decision. But in general, we want to follow a process. We want to make sure that it's facts first and opinions last. We want to make sure that it's not what we necessarily want, but it's what we need. And then we hope to take our time, if we can. There's very few instances where time is not a friend or an advantage. And lastly, have guts to take risks. I'll say one other thing about risks. Calculated risks. And when you take a calculated risk, understand what the consequences are of that risk and be willing to accept those consequences. Then you're in a much better position. Lastly, a quote I heard some years ago, which really brings into play and understanding this decision-making process. It says, every day we're faced with numerous decisions and choices. And try as we may, we often don't choose the right thing that we know is good for us. Part of this is related to the fact that the right choice is often the difficult one, the one that involves some sacrifice. I use this picture of drinking coffee again, and there's a sense of peace and serenity. It's a great picture. And it reinforces the importance of making a decision that you're comfortable with, making a decision that gives you some peace. This statement says, oftentimes we don't make the right decision because we don't want to give up something. My hope as we end this presentation is go through a process, understand the decision that you have to make, understand the consequences of the decision that you're ready and willing to make. And if you're comfortable with the consequences of that decision, make that decision. Even if the decision, as we say, flies in the face, but goes against everything that you've seen in the process. But you have a feeling, just a feeling, that this may work out. Then make that decision, live with the consequences, and hopefully adapt as quickly as you can. There's another saying that says, fail fast, fix it, and move on. I don't know who said it, but fail fast, fix it, and move on. The same can be said for decisions. If you make a decision that's contrary to all of the facts and statistics that you gathered, watch, pay particular attention to the consequences of that decision, and try to adapt as quickly as you can. But never hesitate to make that decision that takes a bit of risk, a bit of guts, because often that is where the greatest consequences are achieved. The greatest consequences for yourself, your organization, and our future. Everybody, take care and enjoy the day.